Hello, I'm Adrian, and welcome to part 4 of my extensive Godzilla review and analysis. If you haven't checked out parts 1 through 3, they are all available in the description, and I highly recommend you do so to get the most out of this review. Naturally, there are spoilers, so I also recommend you watch the films first. Without further ado, join me as we explore Godzilla in the legendary and Reiwa era. Very much like how Godzilla went dormant for a little bit before appearing in a Hollywood adaptation, the same thing happened to Godzilla in 2014. Final Wars was meant to be yet another definitive ending for Toho, allowing room for the Americans to take another shot at adapting Godzilla. And although the film itself is a bit of a mixed bag, it did in fact successfully launch a string of American Godzilla comics, TV shows, and movies that is still going strong today, 10 years later. But let's get to the film itself. The director Gareth Edwards was a big fan of the original and stated in several interviews that he wanted to get back to a more horror-inspired, scary version of Godzilla. So most of the film was appropriately dark, and Godzilla is typically covered in mist, smoke, or nightfall. The tone of the film is also quite bleak most of the time, with the beginning of the film dealing with a slightly dysfunctional family led by Bryan Cranston. The film begins with a nuclear testing montage, actually really similar to Godzilla 98. Much like the Japanese films, it's a very slow burn to get things going. We hear and see strange tectonic activity, and we deal with the human drama for nearly 40 minutes until the new kaiju appear. These giant bug-like kaiju are known as massive unidentified terrestrial organisms, or MUTO for short, and they're being hunted down by a mysterious monster hunting corporation known as Monarch, headed by none other than Dr. Serizawa. Yes, the very same character from the original Godzilla 1954, except in this case he actually wants to protect Godzilla rather than destroy him. Herein lies one of my gripes with the film, is that it very much turns into a film about the MUTOs, with Godzilla being a sort of celebrity guest star rather than a proper Godzilla film. The MUTOs get ample scenes detailing their origin, their weaknesses, their motivations, extra really cool destruction scenes including one set in Vegas, and just overall twice as much screen time as Godzilla himself. While I'm all for developing your villain, I've never been a fan of doing it to such a degree where the hero takes a back seat, kind of like what always happens when the Joker's in a Batman movie. These MUTOs basically act as a placeholder to be able to remake Godzilla 98's plot structure with different monsters. They appear and wreak havoc on the environment in search of a food source, just like Godzilla 98. Then it turns out that they're going to lay eggs that threaten to supplant humans, just like Godzilla 98. They even mourn their young, just like Godzilla 98. In any case, Godzilla finally makes a full appearance about an hour into the movie after seeing small pieces of him beforehand in the suspension bridge, just like in Godzilla 98, hilariously enough. And then the most egregious monster movie snafu occurs, where they cut away from the fight that was about to happen, and we see it played back in small segments on the news. While you could count this as kind of a joke, this isn't the only time this happens, as later on they're going to fight, and the doors are literally and figuratively closed on the frame, preventing anyone from seeing what is going on. However, I must admit that the third act tries to make up for the severe lack of Godzilla screen time, beginning with a brilliant airdropping sequence near Godzilla. It almost looks like a black and white movie, and coupled with the score, evokes those horror movie vibes from the original. This carries over to when Godzilla is revealed through a thick cloud of smoke near Chinatown in San Francisco. The battle itself is well thought out, and isn't too one-sided, thankfully. Furthermore, Godzilla gets to defeat the MUTOs with a brutal tail swing, as well as an out-of-this-world fatality of using his atomic breath. I think Legendary's portrayal of Godzilla's character is 100% right on the money. He's clearly a protector, but that doesn't mean he's above collateral damage or isn't terrifying himself in his own right. He's resilient to human weapons as well, and also retains his atomic breath. He was received with open arms, and this made way for several sequels and comics. I overall am thoroughly enjoying the Monsterverse, as it's now known. I just think that this film was an extremely rough intro to the series. There's little to no monster action, the main protagonist is infinitely more boring than his dad, who seemed much more fleshed out and had a much more interesting backstory, and it also has an extremely slow pace to it as well. But again, certain visuals are exceedingly cool, and it did try to return to a more horror-based Godzilla, something that has been thoroughly abandoned in the Legendary sequels. And just like how the American Godzilla 98 led straight into the Japanese Godzilla 2000, here too the American Godzilla 2014 led to the Japanese Godzilla 2016, but this time the film was called Shin Godzilla. I remember hugely anticipating the film, as I hadn't seen a Toho Godzilla film in theaters since Godzilla 2000, 16 years prior, and so I sat there in a mostly empty theater with a couple of other Godzilla nerds like myself, and was definitely surprised at the film, if not altogether let down by it. But subsequent rewatches have made me come to appreciate it for what it was trying to do differently. Shin Godzilla marks the first time where Godzilla is portrayed as a fully CG created monster in a Toho produced film, something that most of the Godzilla audience and filmmakers were vehemently against back in '98, but the changing landscape in film pretty much guaranteed that very few people would show up to a Godzilla film with suitmation nowadays. Godzilla's design in the film is more akin to that of a parasitic organism than a dinosaur, as he slowly evolves from a humorous semi-aquatic creature dragging itself along the roads to a fully fledged nuclear energy spewing menace. The film begins with a found footage kind of sequence, evocative of the monster film Cloverfield, and soon finds itself trapped inside a few government buildings. It's here where most of the film takes place, as this time we see a Godzilla attack strictly from the point of view of the government trying to make sense of it in real time. It's very much a Godzilla-sized satire of government ineptitude and bureaucracy, a case where the politicians continually miss the forest for the trees. They squabble about where to meet, proper decorum, what to name the creature, who's in charge of what department, and spend more time deciding on the right room for a meeting rather than taking action. Most of the film is about how the real changemakers and action takers are continually held back by ridiculous formalities and the worst kind of government bureaucracy. Now, while all of this makes sense and can be enjoyed if you know what you're getting yourself into, in a vacuum, it makes for a baffling and boring first viewing, as with decades of Godzilla films, you're expecting to meet other characters in the world instead of being confined to that government building and a couple of other nearby locations like streets and rooftops. That being said, most of the visual effects in the film are outstanding, and there are several daytime low-angle shots of Godzilla pushing ships and cars, or just simply walking, that could literally pass as real if you didn't know intuitively that Godzilla doesn't exist. His main Akira Ikofube theme also plays when he appears on shore in his final form, and we get tiny bits and pieces of his genealogy, such as him being capable of mutating and evolving in real time, or in other words, capable of self-mutation, not generational. Godzilla's mobility is greatly reduced from any of his previous films, as he is more of a living, walking tank that mainly moves in a straight path. His arms look more like vestigial appendages, and his legs are barely capable of making him slowly trek across Japan. The standout scene in the whole film, without a doubt, is his first reveal of the atomic breath. It's a hauntingly beautiful destruction scene with an amazing score, and the surprises keep mounting one on top of the other. Not only can he fire an intensely destructive beam of energy, he can disengage his lower jaw and split it open to do so. He can even fire said energy from his dorsal fins to take care of the threat from above. And later in the film, he's even shown firing from his tail. A bit more of his threat is discussed later in the film, and I know I keep referencing Godzilla '98, but here too we see a concept lifted from that film, as this Godzilla is also capable of overrunning the Earth with variants of himself via asexual reproduction. Yes, it's a blink and you miss it screen, but there's a computer simulation that is run in the film labeled as Godzilla's asexual propagation via single organism growth. Here too, the scientists worry that if they don't defeat Godzilla in time, his offspring will mutate and grow and eventually take over the world, with one character even postulating that they may evolve to be smaller and grow wings. Imagine that, a winged Godzilla. But our intrepid heroes eventually solve a riddle left by another genius scientist through the use of supercomputers and origami, and creatively come up with a way of defeating Godzilla through the use of a coagulant and freezing him rather than trying to nuke him. Shin Godzilla marks a return to seeing Godzilla portrayed as an all-out villain, a destructive force with no regard for human life, and with no other monster in sight, no urge to protect either. It was a completely different interpretation than the one in Legendaries, which more closely approximates his neutral protector role seen in his previous eras, such as Heisei, parts of Millennium, and Showa. And this is a tone and theme that will continue all throughout the Reiwa era so far. Even though the next 3 Godzilla movies we will be discussing are animated, I will include them in this video, since although they aren't live action, Toho does consider them to be a part of the official filmography of Godzilla. The premise of the film is that Godzilla grew to be so large of a threat that he literally forced all of humanity to evacuate Earth, and despite them wandering space for 20 years, they still can't find another planet to sustain life the way Earth did. This is probably my favorite part of the film, in the sense that it sets up an elaborate and intriguing backstory to this very dismal what-if scenario. Mechagodzilla malfunctioned and didn't work, and they dropped 150 nuclear warheads on Godzilla and he shrugged it off. They're also running out of resources, and in 8 years all will be lost. But Haruo has seemingly found a weak spot in Godzilla's apparent invulnerability, as the key is to shoot him in a specific area while his invisible shield regenerates, sort of like a Death Star kind of weakness. So they reluctantly launch a small party in an attempt to take him down. Again, the premise sounds really cool, but it's the execution that leaves a lot to be desired. Even though we're dealing with an entirely animated Godzilla, which means that everyone is equally as expensive to put on screen as Godzilla himself, this isn't ever really taken advantage of. No giant kaiju battles, no extensive Godzilla sequences. As a matter of fact, he's barely in the Netflix trilogy at all, usually relegated to appearing in the last 20 minutes of the movies and not doing much of anything. In the same way that Shin Godzilla is a political thriller featuring Godzilla, this is a dystopian sci-fi featuring Godzilla. He's not really the star, just the villain to eliminate. For example, in this case, Godzilla appears 53 minutes into a movie that is barely about an hour and 20 long, and when he does appear, he doesn't move. He's more like a sentient tree. But then the gotcha moment happens, and it turns out they didn't defeat Godzilla, they defeated one of his pseudo-offspring. The real Godzilla then stands up and nearly annihilates all remaining survivors, setting up the sequel. And with this real Godzilla, we get a great look at his design. He towers over all other Godzillas presented thus far at a staggering 300 meters, or nearly 1,000 feet tall. He also has a very dinosaurian appearance, a pronounced jawline and snout, long and jagged dorsal fins, and a really cool skin texture resembling the bark of a tree, no doubt reflecting his incredible age. And in my humble opinion, it's a huge step up from his design in Shin Godzilla. Whereas the previous Netflix film at least revolved around Godzilla's origin, this particular film focuses much more on the dynamics between the humans, the local inhabitants they find on planet Earth, as well as how they're getting along with the two alien races who pledged their allegiance in trying to defeat Godzilla. So what that basically translates to is a whole lot of setup and expository dialogue in dreary caves with humans walking around. Despite the great cliffhanger of the previous film, the storytelling starts at a glacial pace as we learn more about the people that already were on Earth, which are basically followers of a defeated Mothra, and occasionally see our team of survivors shoot down Godzilla-inspired mini-monsters. The film gets so wrapped up in explaining its mythology that it doesn't really focus on any particular aspect long enough to make it engaging. That being said, the cool premise in this film is that the failed Mechagodzilla from so many years ago actually replicated itself and turned itself into a functioning city, which they name Mechagodzilla City, of course. The aliens who created him then can power him up and even use its powerful material, known as nanometal, to upgrade their mechs into basically Zone of the Enders-like flying ones, named Vultures. Once again, they head into battle with Godzilla using the same shield strategy, but with the added power of Mechagodzilla City and their nanometal-infused mechs this time around. What follows is another incredibly well done final battle against Godzilla, involving really cool mech strategy and fantastic sound design. A real highlight of the film, and what I think should have been the focus of it, and lasted much longer than it did. But just like all the other aliens in Godzilla films, these two are not all good, and we're planning on having the nanometal take over their physical forms so they can become closer to being a perfect life form. Our protagonist values human life, so he naturally rebels against this concept of becoming partly artificial or entirely artificial, and tries to save his childhood friend and potential romantic interest as well, and fails, leading to what I hoped would be the biggest downer ending of the trilogy, but boy was I wrong. The film begins even bleaker than the last. Haruo was under fire from back on the ship by the aliens due to not letting the nanometal take over and become Mecha Haruo, and he's also feeling horrible for letting his friends slip into a nanometal coma. Meanwhile, a member of the other alien race that allied themselves, the Exif, is using the entire situation to get more followers for their cult. And in a twist that was probably revealed by the poster itself, it turns out that the cult are followers of none other than King Ghidorah, who in this universe is an incredibly powerful being that consumes everything in front of it. This leads to what is possibly the all-time most haunting and creepy, yet undeniably cool intro sequence for Ghidorah. He appears as serpentine shadows and brutally slices up his followers one by one. He then proceeds to annihilate the ship Haruo was on as well, destroying everyone on it. For the final showdown, it's unfortunately an incredibly slow and one-sided battle. King Ghidorah bites into Godzilla, but Godzilla's blasts and swipes have no effect on him, since Ghidorah is in another plane of existence. Once Haruo figures out how to defeat him with the help of Mothra's people and his scientist buddy, Godzilla quickly dispatches King Ghidorah, who slinks away. So the prep and execution of the mission to defeat Godzilla is gone now, and in its place is a painstakingly slow self-realization sequence for Haruo. Then we get the epilogue, or ending, which I was not a fan of. Haruo's brilliant scientist friend finds a way to activate the fallen vulture, and figures he can reverse engineer it to gain back all lost human technology. Haruo immediately has a vision, and remembers the cult leader's words that Ghidorah will return to finish what he started when they evolve enough. So in a blink of an eye, Haruo decides that the best way to deal with this scenario is to take his comatose friend, abandon the recently pregnant follower of Mothra, mother of his child, steal Jehuri, the vulture, and fly himself straight into Godzilla. I dislike the ending because although it was ultimately selfless for Haruo to sacrifice himself for the greater good, I don't think that would have been what he'd conclude, or at least not that quickly. I really don't think that would be his knee-jerk reaction. He's the guy who went up against Godzilla twice. He didn't let himself get taken over by nanometal to save one person. The guy who thwarted King Ghidorah almost single-handedly. In other words, even when all seems to be lost, he never gives up and wants to keep fighting. For someone who's presented as such a compassionate, intelligent, and strategic thinker who values human life above all else, it seemed completely against character for him to think that offing himself is the only solution. It's not even that permanent either. Who's to say someone else will find nanometal remnants and take it from there? This theme of the value of one's individual life would be revisited again in Minus One, and in a much more thoughtful and considerate manner as well. In sum, even though the trilogy had some insanely cool moments, such as every attack on Godzilla and the arrival of King Ghidorah, or painfully sad moments, such as his friend slipping into a coma, or the virtual annihilation of the human race by Ghidorah, I felt it was a bit bloated. The Godzilla Earth trilogy might have actually worked better as a trimmed down 2-hour or 2.5-hour film. And in terms of Godzilla action, I do wish he would have been more active and less like a barely mobile giant tank. In a trend that was very much in vogue thanks to Captain America Civil War and Batman vs Superman, the third act of the previous film is now seen as a global tragedy controversy. Now in this case, Godzilla's battle with the Mutos has rocked the world, and humanity is coming to terms with the fact that not only that monsters actually exist, but that there are several of them and that they could appear at any moment in time. Right off the bat, the film seems intent on not repeating the same mistakes from the previous one, and ramping everything up to 11. Gone is a boring blank slate audience stand-in main character from the previous film, and in this place we have much more of an ensemble-based cast with a dysfunctional family in the lead that has ties to Monarch. Because of this new cast of characters, there's no need for treating the main character as a conduit to explain things to the audience. And the pace is also much quicker than the previous film, as we go from trying to be a sorta kinda character-driven film to a purely plot-driven film. How quick? The very first monster scene appears literally 7 minutes into the film, with the introduction of Mothra in her cocoon stage. Then before you know it, she hatches, and a shadowy terrorist organization bursts into the scene, guns a-blazing, and appears to kidnap the mom and daughter from the dysfunctional family. Now we finally get to meet Dr. Mark Russell, who plays the role that Nick Tatopoulos played in Godzilla 98, the street-smart scientist who applies his specialized field to the way that Godzilla is behaving. In this case, our guy specializes in wolves, so he's more than familiar with how alphas work and behave in nature. From that point forward in the film, it's a non-stop thrill ride and one amazing, awesome set piece after another strung together by military meetings where they try to make sense of what is going on around them. It felt like watching a modern day interpretation of Showa Godzilla, where Godzilla is a purely heroic figure swimming around the globe taking care of business along the way. And it is exactly the follow-up that Legendary needed after the relatively Godzilla-less previous installment in 2014. I can tell that the writer-director of the film is a huge Godzilla nerd by the sheer amount of references, design choices, and plot points lifted out of Godzilla's extensive legacy. Not only is King Ghidorah an alien, his codename is Monster Zero, just like he was known in Invasion of the Astro Monster, released in the States as Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. Godzilla's new dorsal fins are also much larger and more jagged, just like they were in the original 1954 film. The oxygen destroyer from the original film is also used. Infant Island and Mothra's twins are also referenced, and perhaps most iconically, Burning Godzilla from the Heisei era makes a grand return, and true to form, his power is immense. What I also greatly enjoyed in the film was the sheer amount of beautifully framed and executed monster reveal shots, from Mothra behind a waterfall, to Rodan bursting from a volcano, to Godzilla rhythmically activating his dorsal fins as an intimidation tactic, to King Ghidorah manifesting himself from dark clouds and thunder in the sky, and of course, Godzilla bursting through the sea when he's revived, accompanied by a remix of both his classic Akira Ikufube themes. That one gave me chills. Each head in King Ghidorah having a unique personality was also a really great idea and gave a lot of character to the battles happening on screen. And said battles were plenty in the film, where we get two big matchups between Godzilla and King Ghidorah, a brief underwater skirmish, Mothra vs Rodan, Rodan vs King Ghidorah, along with Godzilla and Mothra vs King Ghidorah. Each one has some pretty spectacular cinematography, with bits and pieces of great fight choreography, but my biggest gripe about it is that none of those scenes were allowed to breathe. Not only were we constantly cutting back to humans, even Godzilla 2014 didn't do this as egregiously, most of the battle shots were shown from a human perspective, which is fine and can work occasionally, but there were one too many shots where the camera swings around the human observing the chaos and therefore relegates the epic monster battle to something that is taking place in the background. The CG looked quite convincing, and I just wish they trusted themselves a bit more in letting it shine and not hiding it behind crazy camera movements and human onlookers. In sum, the film is leaps and bounds better than Godzilla 2014 and cemented this version of Godzilla as one of my absolute favorites, and it was clearly made for fans by fans of the franchise. And the cherry on top is that the end credit sequence implies that at one point we will get to see Mecha King Ghidorah, and I seriously hope that happens, because not only is he one of Godzilla's coolest looking adversaries, he happens to be my brother's favorite monster in the franchise. Ever since I was a Godzilla fan, I've been dreaming of a rematch between these two giants after seeing how Godzilla lost in the original. I taped said original on VHS when it played on Sci-Fi Channel and rewatched the fight so many times the tape got worn out. I even made an at-home remake of the film using my toys, and I do intend on tracking down that footage and posting it one day. So I was naturally over the moon when it was announced that Godzilla would once again face off against King Kong. What's also a pretty crazy coincidence is that in Toho's original run, King Kong vs. Godzilla was the third movie Godzilla appeared in, and in Legendary's Godzilla films, Godzilla vs. Kong is also the third Godzilla film in their Godzilla series, not counting Kong's standalone film of course. In any case, let's get to the review proper. The movie very clearly sets up Kong as a main character and benevolent hero of the story, and Godzilla as a crazed villain. The movie starts out with Kong and everyone around him remarking how they're trying to keep him safe from Godzilla. The movie also has a mostly new set of characters this time around, and the only real carryover character from the previous film is Madison Russell, and they've unfortunately all but written out her father, who I find to be an incredibly good actor, mostly from the time spent watching him in the great drama Friday Night Lights. Godzilla attacks 10 minutes in, which is a new record for Godzilla's first appearance in the Monsterverse, and so much better than the entire hour it took for his debut film in said Monsterverse. However, he's up to no good this time, and is out wrecking Apex Cybernetics, the very same company that is established near the end of the Apple TV show Monarch. To be honest, the first time I was seeing the film, I thought we were once again dealing with a Godzilla imposter who turned out to be Mechagodzilla, but it isn't so. That's the real Godzilla behaving like a complete monster. And herein lies the introduction of the main subplot, or B story really, with the A story being Godzilla vs. Kong, where Madison Russell decides to go on a side quest to investigate the reasoning behind Godzilla's attack with the help of her friend Josh and a crackpot conspiracy podcaster Bernie. While spending a couple minutes with this trio would have been fine, it unfortunately becomes a staple of the film, where we routinely cut back to them to see what crazy shenanigans they end up in, like we're in a Scooby-Doo episode. It became frustrating as the A story dealing with Kong's protective circle of humans was much more interesting and directly relevant to the main encounter, whereas Madison's felt like filler. My guess is that it had a lot to do with Millie Bobby Brown's rising star power due to Stranger Things, and they felt compelled to give her a bigger role in the movie than the last time. In any case, returning to the A story, Kong ends up being pinned down on a large ship, much like he was in the original King Kong vs. Godzilla. This time they're going to try to use him to open up a portal into Hollow Earth instead of trying to start up a major advertising campaign, like in the original. In any case, while Kong is traveling to said location site, Godzilla tracks him down and bulldozes through a couple battleships to get to him. The battle itself is actually well put together and is a lengthy 7-minute one too. The frequent cuts to human reactions from Godzilla King of the Monsters are gone, and many of the battle shots are allowed to breathe a little. It's truly impressive stuff, and it's not even the main fight yet. A huge step up from their barely there skirmish in the original, where Kong runs off after feeling a bit burned by Godzilla's atomic breath. That being said, I feel Godzilla's heel turn, as they would say in pro wrestling, stems from him being absolutely consumed with fighting titans and asserting his dominance. He has become restless from not having a real home anymore. This is further explored in the comic prequel to the film, aptly called Godzilla Dominion, where Godzilla swims from coast to coast fighting other titans that get out of line. Godzilla laments the loss of his home since it was annihilated by Dr. Serizawa when he revived him, and is trying to search for a new one. He remembers Skull Island, and he sets his sights on claiming it for himself. But lo and behold, Kong is gone by the time he gets there. So now not only is he in a mad quest to assert his dominance, he might even see Kong as a reason why he doesn't have a home. Add to this that he can tell that they are creating Mechagodzilla, and you have the recipe for a rage-fueled monster that barely resembles how heroically he had been portrayed thus far, and has therefore been turned into the villain of the story. In a way, he's like a corrupted Batman in Batman vs. Superman. In this case, Godzilla's quest for asserting his dominance has blinded him in being able to see that Kong is not his enemy. With the imminent danger of transporting Kong by water, they decide to airlift him the rest of the way. And what's pretty awesome is that this also resembles the same scene in King Kong vs. Godzilla where Kong is airlifted through special tension cables one of the protagonists created. Later on, Kong gets another cool battle with a cobra monster that looks just like one of the ones Godzilla fought in Godzilla the series. It's at this point where I sort of lamented that Godzilla became the bad guy in his own movie, as let's not forget this is called Godzilla vs. Kong, not Kong vs. Godzilla, and as a result, not only gets far less screen time than Kong does, but has a very ominous dark theme played alongside him whenever he appears. Around 1 hour and 20 minutes into the film, the main event begins, and it is the most epic and well done confrontation thus far into the Monsterverse, and one of the very best Godzilla fights of all time. Kong uses his superior speed and ingenuity to successfully dodge virtually every single one of Godzilla's atomic breath blasts, and gets in more than a few hits thanks to a superpowered axe that he obtained from Hollow Earth. Meanwhile, Godzilla tries to overpower Kong by using just a few melee attacks, but primarily uses his atomic breath in an attempt to quickly finish the fight. The camera work is incredibly dynamic, and the bright neon-soaked lighting is just out of this world and looks perfect alongside Godzilla's bright blue beams and dorsal fins. And although one of the characters of the film does remark that the second round goes to Kong, that third round and victory goes to Godzilla. He returns from being knocked out by the axe with newly found strength and ditches trying to use his atomic breath and goes beast mode on Kong with a series of savage, brutal, and furious melee attacks. He judo flips him over his shoulder and proceeds to use his tail, his claws, his jaws, and even moves around like a deranged alligator to get to him quicker at points. It's one of the most brilliantly choreographed and executed combos I've ever seen Godzilla do in any of his films, and I was smiling from ear to ear. Godzilla finally got to redeem himself after losing all those years ago in the original King Kong vs. Godzilla. But the film is intent on making you feel bad for Kong, so they play sad music, and Kong can be heard vocalizing in pain as he lies on the floor, apparently down for the count. And that's when they send Mechagodzilla in, who has gone rogue, just like he did in Tokyo SOS, and attacks Godzilla. At this point, Godzilla is exhausted and gets his tail handed to him by Mecha G, as he basically throws him around like a rag doll across the city. But Kong is successfully revived, and together they bring him down. It's once again very similar to Batman vs Superman, except here Doomsday is Mechagodzilla. The fight is once again shot really well. I just wish it wasn't so one-sided, with Godzilla barely getting any hits in. However, this is pretty consistent with how his initial fights with Mechagodzillas go in the past. They use their superior firepower and extra weapons to overpower him. In conclusion, the film features some of the best fights in the Monsterverse and the Godzilla series as a whole, and absolutely delivers on its central versus fight. That being said, it's not as strong a film overall as King of the Monsters, thanks to its over-reliance on the B story that goes virtually nowhere, a sort of Canto Bight Casino from The Last Jedi. Had that entire sequence been cut, or at least considerably shortened, it would have helped the overall quality and pacing of the film tremendously, as you'd get nothing but the A story, just like its predecessor. Look up any review for this movie and you will find it being praised for being the first good Godzilla film, and when such highly successful and acclaimed directors including Steven Spielberg and Christopher Nolan also join in on such praise, one tends to notice. And in truth, it really is not only a good Godzilla movie, but a good movie overall. It explores themes of redemption, of self-sacrifice, and even love, and for a Godzilla film, that's pretty heavy. However, something that is usually downplayed or downright ignored is that in many ways, Godzilla Minus One is a remake of the original. It uses that framework and takes inspiration from several of the films that came before it to create a new dramatic Godzilla film that will entertain classic Godzilla fans as well as newcomers who may have never before seen a Godzilla film in their life. So let's explore this a little deeper. The fact that it reverts all the way back to a post-war Japan is no coincidence, as this is exactly when the original takes place as well. It heavily relies on post-war nuclear imagery to show the destruction and despair that was prevalent in Japan during that time. The very title of it makes that clear, with the director saying that the end of World War II took Japan to zero, and Godzilla takes it to beyond that, to -1 or -1. Even the structure of the film mimics the original, with Godzilla first damaging boats, eventually climbing ashore and destroying Japanese cities, including the very same clock tower shown in the original, with an almost identical sequence of reporters atop said clock tower being taken down too. In the original, Dr. Serizawa comes up with the oxygen destroyer to take out Godzilla, but here the scientist comes up with a freezing plan not unlike the one seen just a few years earlier in Shin Godzilla. With Godzilla seemingly defeated, we go deep into the ocean to see that Godzilla 2000 Regenerator G1 ability still continued to work, and Godzilla is still technically alive. just like he was with his beating heart at the end of GMK. One of my favorite scenes of the film happens early on, when a pre-nuclear Godzilla attacks a lone Japanese island in the middle of the night. This version of Godzilla looks much more dinosaurian than monster, and it is the exact same concept seen in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, with a Godzillasaurus surviving being nuked and turned into Godzilla proper. On a personal level, I really enjoyed how this incarnation of Godzillasaurus moved and looked much more like a real theropod with a hunched over position, more of a digigrade version of locomotion rather than a plantigrade as he is once he mutates, along with large and powerful jaws that he uses to attack. And not only that, when put alongside Godzilla 98, he more than bears a passing resemblance to his shape and form, something made extremely clear when comparing the vinyl figures side by side. I think this validates 98's form, as its creator, Patrick Tatopoulos, was clearly going for a more realistic take on Godzilla, and the filmmakers behind Minus One must have agreed on it, at least on a visual standpoint, as this looks much more similar to this guy than this guy, the original Godzillasaurus from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And let's take a moment to discuss Godzilla Minus One's design. This is a design that is actually the 3.0 version of Godzilla from director Takashi Yamazaki. His first interpretation of Godzilla appeared briefly in a dream sequence in the Japanese film Always Sunset on 3rd Street 2. The second version, and the one which most closely resembles the final, appears in Godzilla the Ride. And the third version is a refinement of those previous two along with a healthy dose of Heisei influence. Godzilla's Heisei face is definitely there, but it's more reptilian and dinosaurian than before, as it features internalized ears and even more scoots around the head, something which I think works perfectly well considering this Godzilla evolved from a more realistic interpretation of a dinosaur. The design also incorporates the large jagged-like dorsal fins from the Millennium era, along with the classic bright blue color when the atomic breath is lighting up. And fun fact, the gradual power-up effect with the dorsal fins, although seen on the big screen in Godzilla 2014, actually hails from Godzilla the series. I really enjoy this design, and it's probably my favorite of the Reiwa era so far, as it pays tribute to classic Godzilla in a very modern way. Speaking of the visuals, what was once thought impossible actually happened. Godzilla took home the Oscar for Best Visual Effects. This was a big moment, as in its 70-year film history, no film in the Godzilla franchise had ever been nominated, let alone win anything. And it couldn't have deserved it more. Every single Godzilla shot was incredibly well animated, lit, and composited, making for one of the most satisfying and realistic destruction scenes ever made in the series. Even my brother, who's an animator and works in visual effects, commented on how he would have animated Godzilla in the exact same way for the atomic breath sequence, that it was virtually perfect. It was also insanely cool to visually see how Godzilla can heal himself on the fly, seeing that Regenerator G1 in action. And once again, giving credit where credit is due, Godzilla 98 was the first one to venture in this territory of rendering Godzilla on a computer, and it did pave the way for audiences to accept Godzilla being portrayed in that manner, as there was a significant amount of backlash to Godzilla being CG back in the day. Godzilla Minus One is a landmark film in the franchise, as not only did it bring back the gravitas that it really never got back to since the original, but it did so in a way that pleased all audiences and critics at the same time. And what's even wilder is that we exist in a time where instead of a couple of years, sometimes half a decade or more going by before the next Godzilla film, the next one was out in less than a year. And that film is... I went into this movie with really high expectations. After the incredible battle scene in Godzilla vs. Kong, and the fact that they kept the very same director to do the sequel, I was expecting great things. And although there are plenty of battles in this movie, and quite a few things I enjoyed, I was truly disheartened to see that it's very much a Kong-focused movie, guest starring Godzilla. The movie starts off with probably the coolest opening of all time. We spend a little time with Kong, where he has his first big chase fight scene with some overgrown rat-like monsters, and finally check back in with the big guy, Godzilla. He bursts into the scene and quickly defeats the tentacle crab monster. And the fact that we got a mini battle to start off the movie left me pumped for more. The movie takes a breather and starts setting the scene. Turns out there's a strange distress call happening from Hollow Earth, and our intrepid heroes must go down to investigate it. This time neither Millie Bobby Brown or her fictional dad are anywhere near the movie, and we instead follow Kong's expert scientist Eileen Andrews and her adopted daughter Gia, the crazy podcaster monster expert Bernie Hayes, and a brand new kaiju vet that serves to be even crazier than our crazy podcaster. Meanwhile, Godzilla is prepping for the biggest fight in his life, as he is absorbing nuclear power plants and swims down to another Titan's domain, Tiamat, in order to kill and absorb her power too. I feel this was an absolute genius move from a scriptwriting standpoint, as there's nothing more fun than following Godzilla around as he wrecks different kaiju. It totally worked in Legendary's King of the Monsters, as well as Godzilla Final Wars, and I feel this was probably the biggest missed opportunity of the movie. We could have gotten lengthy Titan battles with Godzilla, or at the very least several bite-sized battles, kind of like Final Wars where he lays waste to them in fun vignettes. But no, he only takes down Titans in 2 fun, well choreographed, albeit extremely short battles, swats down a couple helicopters, and then spends the rest of the movie powering up in a coma-like state. Said second underwater battle was lit extremely well and had a gravitas to it that the others did not. And in lieu of seeing all that would-be spectacular Titan destruction with Godzilla, we instead spend a lot of time with Kong. And when I mean a lot of time, I mean this is Kong's movie through and through. We see him investigate Hollow Earth, we see him bond with a younger ape. They reminded me a lot of Kratos in the newer God of War games. I mean, he even has a full beard and axe. And we also get to see him fight more apes, along with having a one-on-one fight with Scar King, who my brother exclaimed was Lanky Kong as soon as he saw him in theaters for the first time, and I agree wholeheartedly. As a matter of fact, due to the lack of scale, I couldn't help but think of these sequences as a revisited Planet of the Apes. This is perhaps what bothered me the most about the movie, as when the director mentioned in several interviews that there are many extended sequences with hardly any human interaction, he was only referring to King Kong, not Godzilla. Godzilla scenes last maybe 1 or 2 minutes at a time and are immediately interrupted by something else. I got chills several times seeing him just because he looked so incredibly cool, and every moment spent on frame was awesome, but I was left very disappointed that he would only appear in spurts. That being said, Mothra appearing in the movie was a huge surprise for me. I had no idea she was going to be in the film, and she provided invaluable help to the humans and stopped Godzilla from killing Kong. Said Godzilla vs. Kong rematch was pretty fun, and reminded me a lot of Iron Man trying to get Hulk to stand down in Avengers Age of Ultron. I especially appreciated how Godzilla did a full-on suplex on Kong, but Godzilla listens to Mothra and Gia, so he allies himself with Kong. It's here where we can really appreciate Godzilla's redesign, and I'm all for it. He's much leaner this time around, sporting a very muscular look. Not only that, his jaw is much more pronounced and has rugged spikes coming out of it, making him look oh so similar to my favorite Godzilla design of all time, Godzilla 98. His glowing dorsal fins also remind me of Godzilla 2000's purple hues, and the fact that he's so lively and maneuverable in this installment is awesome, and I feel there's so much potential for fantastic battles with this design and energy in the future. Perhaps the biggest and most appropriate design change was giving him an authentic Thagomizer. That's a scientific term for the group of spikes near a Stegosaurus tail, which curiously enough was taken from a Gary Larson Far Side comic by paleontologists, and it stuck. In any case, Godzilla's original design was based on a combination of a T-Rex and a Stegosaurus, so Godzilla finally having a Thagomizer makes so much sense. So we ride off into the battle, and after a truly epic face-off shot, the gravity changes, leading to some pretty cool aerial battles between the monsters that were inventive, but felt short and rushed compared to the build-up of said fight. Upon arriving to Brazil, Godzilla doesn't really do anything but tackle Shimu a few times. And then the final hit is once again delivered by Kong, not by Godzilla, as this time he just adds in a random tail whip, which while looking awesome, goes by in less than a second and is a one good hit. He lands on Scar King before Kong smashes him to pieces. I just didn't understand why Godzilla needed so much of a power-up if he didn't end up contributing almost anything to the final battle. Again, he looks absolutely amazing, and this is my favorite legendary Godzilla design so far. He just got so precious little to do in his own movie. And it's weird too, because according to its very own lore, Godzilla imprisoned Scar King, Shimu, and his tribe of kaiju gorillas all by himself. So the fact that an even more powered up Godzilla doesn't decimate Scar in 3 seconds doesn't make any sense. And side note, that could have been a cool flashback sequence as well, at least give Godzilla one more scene. My brother isn't a huge fan of how everything is one big silly slugfest now without a serious component to it either, while I'm a little more forgiving as I did enjoy Godzilla's Showa era. Even the Showa era knew to make Godzilla the star. When Jet Jaguar showed up, he didn't overshadow Godzilla in any way, he helped in the fight, but it was Godzilla's battle and victory through and through. Here I feel that Kong did overshadow him, despite not being the first one mentioned in the title. Sure, it's easier to connect with Kong since he's more like a human, and he can just hang out without destroying anything, but that doesn't mean we need to be spending so much time with him. I really wanted to love this movie, and while I did enjoy several sequences, including every scene Godzilla's in, this should have been called Kong x Godzilla, as Godzilla is by no means the star monster of the film. Furthermore, with each installment, Godzilla becomes less and less of a thinking creature and more like a mindless brute that reacts on instinct alone, which I don't really like. And again, if Godzilla had gotten the lion's share of the fight sequences like Kong did, I would be singing a completely different tune. I enjoy seeing a fun and silly Godzilla. I enjoy seeing a somber and serious Godzilla. There's room for all sorts of interpretations to Godzilla, as we've seen so far in this series. That is what is so great about his character in the first place. But what I don't enjoy is when he isn't the star monster of his own movie. Just like in Mothra vs. Godzilla, Godzilla and Mothra, and even Godzilla 2014. However, the future of Godzilla looks brighter than ever. Godzilla x Kong made a profit at the box office, and a Monsterverse sequel is in the works. And the director of Minus One, Takashi Yamazaki, has expressed interest in making a Kaiju vs. Kaiju sequel that takes itself seriously. And Apple also greenlit a second season of Monarch. So there is more Godzilla in the way, and there has frankly never been a better time to be a Godzilla fan. Anyhow, those are my 2 cents. What did you think? And more importantly, what did you think of the Godzilla series as a whole? As of the making of this video, there are now 39 Godzilla films with a Godzilla Minus One sequel on the way, as well as more legendary installments as mentioned. What do you think the future of Godzilla will bring? Which has been your favorite one so far? Let me know below, as I will be actively responding on this video. Thanks so much for watching. See you guys next time. I'd like to thank each one of my Patreon members, as their contribution helped in the making of this video. If you'd like to contribute and appear in the credits in the future, my Patreon page is Godzillarex, and it's in the description below.